Welcome to History Chats here on this Thursday afternoon. My name is Ben Clark. I'm the archivist and historian here at the Marathon County Historical Society. Right now we're doing a theme, weekly thing. So for the last couple weeks, we've been doing People You Should Know as our theme. And this week we're going to be talking about Councilwoman Helen Ohm. Helen is notable for a bunch of reasons, a lot of reasons, really. An amazing woman all the way around. But one of the things that the kind of big thing here is she is the first city councilwoman to sit and to be elected in Wausau, which also means that she's the first in Marathon County. And honestly, as far as I can tell, the first in Wisconsin. There's actually there is another woman, Josephine Herring, who I think is elected also in April of 1922 to the city council of, and I'm blanking on the name of the city that she's from, but another Wisconsin woman. But she technically was elected a week after Helen, the elections. And as we'll see, Helen was actually sitting for a very brief time on the city council before her. So I think, as far as I can tell, she is the first in Wisconsin, which is pretty cool and completely unexpected, considering the track record that we've had, with the suffrage movement here in central Wisconsin. We're not the strongest region in support of that, and yet, here, 1920, 19th Amendment comes around, women can vote for equal, as equals. And, a year and a half later, here is the first woman being elected here in Wausau. So Helen is born in 1896. Let's just kind of get through her early life here. Born in 1896 to a German immigrant family. She is born here, and both of her parents are pretty much, Americans at this point, but technically they did immigrate. She goes on, as you can see here, to study at the training school, the normal school here in the county. And then she goes on to teach for a little bit. So after this 1916, she goes and teaches in the town of Fleeth. And then the next year, we think, we don't have exactly the specifics of where she's teaching when, but it seems like she then goes on and teaches in the town of Knowlton. But in 1920, she comes back to Wausau. Bunch of reasons why this could be. We don't exactly know for sure. Maybe she just wasn't, enjoying teaching in a one-room schoolhouse out in the, the rural part of the county. Maybe she wanted to come home and do something else, help with her family. But ultimately, she does end up working here at the, this is a picture of from its era in the National German American Bank, but by this point they had changed their name to the First American National Bank. And so this is where she works, starting a long career working in business. She is, basically a businesswoman. Works as a clerk, as a bookkeeper. She is going to, work in a variety of different places over the next, 20, 30 years or so. In the mid-20s, she moves to the American Savings and Loan Company. I think that's what it was called. By the 50s, she's working for Kickbush Grocery. And I'll throw in here also, just to kind of sum up her working experience. By the late 30s, she is hired and then ends up kind of working her way up the ranks to be the head of the pensions department for Marathon County. So, a lot of experience there. But back in 1920, she's not just getting involved in business. She's also getting involved in politics, which is, again, really remarkable for a young woman in the 1920s in central Wisconsin. This is not the norm. But she's, talking to people. She's getting to know the issues. She's writing letters to the editor, doing all this kind of fun stuff. So a little bit about politics. What is local politics at this point? So for example, here we have a little map of Wausau. This is from 1915. Wausau is actually represented, if depending on where you lived, just like today, you'd be represented on a different levels. So in this case, this is a nice sort of indication of the third ward where she lives up here. She's in the 3rd ward of Wausau. At this point, there are 9 wards in Wausau. These are basically just electoral districts, if give or take, right? But there's a bunch here. It kind of divvies up the city. But she's in the 3rd ward, and that means that she is represented both at the county level and at the city level through elected officials at the 3rd ward. So to kind of explain this situation, there's the City Council of Wausau, right, which is often sometimes at this point called the Common Council. It's also, just to kind of clarify the terminology, you might hear the word alderman or alderwomen as opposed to councilmen or councilwomen. And that basically they're interchangeable for the most part. But yeah, so there's 2 representatives for each of Wausau's 9 wards on the city council. And then there's the county board, which is represented by 1 representative for each of the townships. At this point, there's about 42 of them. And then there's 1 for each ward in every city and village. So in this case, you have, city council, Marathon County Board of Supervisors. And then basically what happens is those 2 representatives that are elected from each city council ward, or for the city council, one of them, that's the overlap. They also sit on the County Board of Supervisors. This is all going to be relevant, in a minute here. So bear with me with this. So again, for Helen, then, she is represented in 1920 by 2 people, basically. Louis Leake, who was the alderman supervisor. He sat on both boards. And then there was George Borowitz, who represented just at the city council. So there's a couple things to kind of know about this. This is relevant because she is going to basically replace one of these men. But the context here is kind of interesting. So in 1921, there are some rumors about Supervisor Leake's goings-on. He is alleged to have, some rumors going around. Eventually, there's a commission that's put up, a committee to investigate these rumors. And basically, they come back and say he is guilty of basically charging personal expenses to the county treasurer. He had some stuff delivered to his personal home, and then he wrote that off and said, charge the county. Stuff like wallpaper for his home, some cordwood for, to keep warm, that sort of stuff. So that's kind of not a great thing, right? We don't really, you don't want to get caught doing that, or you don't want to do that. You shouldn't be doing that if you are an elected official. So they come back and they say, yep, he did this. And then they ask for his resignation, which he gives. And so in January of 1922, Leake leaves. He resigns. He is replaced. There's another election coming up. This is in February. There's an election in April. So it's not like a long-term thing. So in case there was something that came up in that month, George Borowitz would represent the 3rd ward of Wausau on the county board, basically kind of step into that seat. And in the intermediate period, they were going to, they gave Helen Ohm a shot. So this is where she is appointed in 1922. Now, to understand the context for why she gets appointed, beyond the fact that she is a very capable person in her own right and is sort of qualified and wants to be in the position, she had announced her candidacy. But one of the things you kind of have to keep in mind in the context of 1920-21, all of these guys, most of the city council, were elected as nonpartisans. So, without getting too deep into the politics of the 19-teens and 20s, during World War I, there was a real shift in the politics of Marathon County. The German Americans, not so happy about the way that the Republicans and Democrats are really treating the German community. Because World War I is happening, we're at war with Germany, and obviously the patriotic thing to do is to bash the Germans. Not just criticize them publicly, but maybe we ought to keep an eye on people who speak German in the public, or so on and so forth. So they vote socialist, actually, as a protest vote. We actually have a huge number of socialists who are elected in the 1918 through 1920. Now, by 1920, things are kind of falling apart for the socialists. They're not able to make concrete goals. The war is over. People start protest. The protest vote kind of disappears. But, and one of the things that they end up doing, basically the establishment people are still not super popular running as Republicans or Democrats. Now, that's not to say that they would have ran earlier. This is kind of sort of separate to this. They wouldn't necessarily have identified as being like a Republican in 1912, for example. But in this case, the nonpartisan is really important because they're trying to put this image of them being, we're not going to be politics. We're going to put our duty first, their city first. We're not partisan. And beyond that, they also tried to, paint themselves as being better than the socialists, because the socialists got into some sort of minor controversy. Well, depending on what, who you ask, some controversy, right? I think a lot of it was overblown by the establishment people who were really afraid that the socialists were going to be making some big changes, and they wanted to get them out as soon as possible. But that's kind of the situation we're in. So 1921, 22, they really don't want to empower the socialists to come back. And so the fact that, Leake gets kicked out because of, some not so great things he was doing, they really need somebody who's going to, be unimpeachable, right? So George Borowitz, he's kind of going to run to fill Leake's old seat. But Helen is really interesting because she's a woman. And I think this is kind of interesting to keep in mind. So again, to kind of go back a little bit, in 1919 and 1920, the 19th Amendment is going to pass. It's going to go through all of the states. It's become the law of land. Women can vote as equals, at least under the Constitution. The suffrage movement, all of these men and women, mostly the women who were really being vocal and trying to be involved in the public sphere to get this passed, they didn't then, now that they had the votes, try to translate that into a political party. They didn't try to say, all right, great, now we're going to get us, other women to be new governors and presidents and city council people. Like, that wasn't necessarily the goal. If it happened, great. That's not necessarily something they were against. But they step into a role instead of saying, we wanted to vote, not so that we could decide who was in charge, or not so that we could be in charge, but rather that so we had a say in who could be in charge. So that way, if somebody like, for example, George Leake or Louis Leake, if, for example, he was doing stuff that maybe was the women of the community were not happy with, they would like to be able to say, hey, we would not like him to represent us. And so they step into this role being framed as being watchdogs of the government almost, right? They are for good governance. They're going to keep an eye on the government, and they're just going to be a check on things to make sure that maybe social issues that men might be willing to not address because of, it doesn't affect men. Well, then the women can have a say if that becomes a big of an issue. And so in all this context, putting Helen in charge, and we can tell here, this is a newspaper article that she, or a letter to the editor that she wrote in response to her appointment and her announcement of her candidacy. And she says, people are asking me what my politics are. And here in the middle, she says, I'll take my stand for good, clean, straight city politics. Why not choose men and women on their own merits and on their own integrity and not on the glowing promises of some political regime? And at the bottom here, she says, since every public office seeker has a so-called platform, mine can be summed up briefly in these words: work for Wausau. She's not in this to play politics. She just wants to do her best. And this is very much in line with the nonpartisans. It's very much in line with, again, not to say that she's putting on airs and trying to play political games in just a different way. She's definitely somebody who deserves the position. But she also happens to be the right person for the moment, right? Was not without controversy, though. Her appointment, and I'm going to hide my video here for a second so you can see. So this is another article that she wrote in response to some criticism of her appointment, in which somebody was very vocally saying, how dare they appoint a mere girl to be our representative, especially somebody who never owns property. And her response is really, I think this really gives an insight into her character and the way that she was operating at this time. She says, and I'm just going to read because I think her words do a better job of me explaining it. First, I'd like to say that I'm very sorry if I should bring disgrace to the city council or to any citizen of Wausau, and particularly to any of the Third Ward. However, since hearing these protests, I have carefully investigated and I find property ownership is unnecessary to fill the office of an alderman. Very true, I have no property in my name, but for many years I have paid my share of taxes on 3 properties, all of which are located in the Third Ward. Property ownership might be a desirable requirement, but what puzzles me is the fact that all these years, some people were perfectly willing to be represented by non-taxpayers. And now, when this mere girl wants to do her best, some suddenly woke up. I am glad. I think it's a good sign. People are beginning to think. But hasn't it ever been deemed advisable to inquire into these matters before? Have we entrusted our privileges so carefully? Very respectfully, Helen Ohm. And I think it's a really restrained way to respond to like, hey, you're not actually mad that I'm being appointed. You're mad because I'm a woman, and you just can't say that anymore. But the way that she handles this, I think, is a really good insight into her and the way that she handles herself, with very, very effectively, I think, the way that she kind of turns the argument around in a very subtle way like that. So she does run. April comes around and she wins, but not by that much. As you can see, both Emil Egerbright and Walter Winetsky both have just 4 votes shy of Helen's total. So she does not have a majority, but she does have the most. And so she is elected, and she is actually sitting on the city council as the first councilwoman in the history of Wisconsin. So that's pretty cool. She is appointed to the Recreation Committee, which does mean that she gets put in charge of planning a party for the 4th of July in 1923. But very characteristic of Helen, she throws herself into finding opportunities to make a difference. So in particular, she gets involved in investigating the dance halls, which were kind of becoming a bigger and bigger thing at this point, and weren't necessarily the cleanest place you could go to clean entertainment. She reports here, she says that they, in her report, in her investigation, that they were veritable hellholes. So yeah, she's part of this crusade of investigating and trying to get some people to look into this and to regulate dance halls, to make it so that maybe the people who are own and run the dance halls should kind of check to see, are these kids that are showing up of age? Is there some, maybe not so great desirable behavior that's happening, that sort of thing. She also is involved in trying to find an opportunity to provide a safe place to go swimming for kids. This is specifically looking for a bathing beach, but they end up kind of hitting on a municipal pool. It's not really an easy thing to do to go swimming in the summertime. If it's hot, you want to cool off. There's not really a great beach in Wausau. And so people would go swimming in the river, and the river, this is before, you get swimming lessons as a kid, so people aren't strong swimmers, there's no lifeguards on duty. People died every year trying to swim. And so they wanted a safe place, a municipal swimming pool for people to go and swim safely, which ultimately does happen, not necessarily when Helen's in charge. She kind of is done by this point, but she is going to be involved in sort of finding a location, kind of creating the idea and getting things moving, especially from the financial side, to create the funding and the funds to allow this to happen. But in 1924, after her term 2 years is done, she decides not to run again. And asked about whether or not she would, she was quoted as saying that she gave an emphatic no to the query as to whether or not she will be a candidate. And I think there's a couple reasons why you could say this. I don't know for sure one way or the other, but maybe there's other things that she had to do, take care of. Maybe she just didn't have the time or the energy. I would imagine it was also a pretty rough experience being a woman on the city council in 1923, 24. I don't think it's that controversial to say that most, on average, women today in the public sphere are have it harder than men. I can only imagine what it would have been like, even with some support and some people who were really happy to have her and wanted to support her and encourage her, that's kind of probably a rough gig. And so I would imagine that might, at least kind of played a role in that, if nothing else. But she's not gone forever. In the meantime, she goes back to the public sphere, gets involved in other things, again, kind of works at the pensions department. But she returns in 1944, is elected to once again represent the 3rd Ward on the city council. And this time she actually, again, makes history by not just getting her old seat as the city councilwoman, but actually also the supervisor position, the Borowitz's position that he had. So she becomes the first woman to sit on the Marathon County Board of Supervisors. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into all that she was doing at this point, although, again, very much active in a lot of different ways and trying to bring that perspective to the county board. But the next big thing that happens actually in 1947, she is actually elected to be the vice chairman of the county board. And so this is the board proceedings saying this, that she is going to be elected. And 2 years later, in 1949, Dr. Schultz, who is the chairman, was not unable to attend a meeting. And so Helen becomes the first woman in the history of Wisconsin to oversee a county board meeting. So again, she just keeps making more and more firsts, being this pioneer of women in public office. She continues to run until 1954, in which case, at this point, her bid for re-election is defeated finally. And so she is no longer, for the first time in many, many years, not representing the third ward in some capacity as an elected official. And about 12 years later, she does pass away in 1966. Again, a lot of stuff happening in between. I'm just going to kind of smooth over it so that we can get through this in some amount of time here. But looking at her legacy, apologize here. Okay. She's in a lot of other organizations besides just being, elected official. She's in the Business Professional Women's Club. She's a charter member of the League of Women Voters and the Altrusa Club, who are both really important for women in their time. She's a board of trustees at the Public Library, the University Extension campus. She's a board of directors there. She's on the board of directors for the local Salvation Army and the GOP Women. And I kind of want to, end her story because this is, one of the many reasons why I really, appreciate Helen. Apparently at a meeting of the Altrusa Club in the late 40s, early 50s, I think 1951, but I'm just kind of, not positive on that date. She actually, for the Altrusa Club says, hey, you know what we ought to have this in Marathon County? A historical society for the whole county. And so they do it. The Altrusa Club then works to get this stuff in motion. We often go back and we say like the founders of the Historical Society are D.C. Everest and Ed Fromm and the Haggies and these really important men in the community who sign on and give their face, their support to this. But in many ways, it was women like Helen and the Altrusa Club members and other volunteers who really make it possible for the Historical Society to exist. So who knows? Back in in the early 50s. Had Helen not said that, I might not be able to be having this discussion with you right now, because I'm speaking to you from the Historical Society right now. So that's her legacy. She never married, never had children, but certainly leaves more in a lot of ways. And I want to end here. It's not just, I say that she's a pioneer and how ahead of her time that she was, I think really illustrated by the fact that it takes until 1972 for Mary McLean to be the next woman not named Helen Ohm to be elected to either the City Council of Wausau or the County Board of Supervisors. In this case, she is both. That's 50 years after Helen first is elected in 1922. That's a long time. And of course, over the course of the 70s, you have this whole movement in which women are starting to assert themselves in new ways and wanting to be involved in governance, not just have a say by voting. So you do have, in this picture, Jacqueline Turk and Jane Wiley as well, both elected in the 70s. And of course, as time went on, there's been more representation. Still not, I would say, equal, if that's what we're shooting for. But still, I think a lot of progress has been made since the 70s, not so much in Helen's life, which is a shame. And that just goes to show how far ahead of the game that she was in her life. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to actually continue this. Gary's going to come back here and tell us about Ali Bach-Wig, who was one of the guys who really made the paper companies profitable and made it a thing here in central Wisconsin. And I think we're going to also use this as an opportunity to talk not just about Ali, but also about the early Mosinee, which is where he kind of was involved, and the paper industry as a whole. So definitely, again, next week at 12:30, Thursdays, we're doing this every week. So that's will be the topic next week. For now, I think maybe we'll call that an afternoon here. Have a wonderful afternoon or whenever you're watching this, and we will see you all next week.